Hello, and welcome back to Virtually Reality's Spring-Summer 2021 series subtitled The Long Triumph. Over 10 weeks and nearly 30 separate events, The Long Triumph addresses the knowing sprawl of a world that has been machinically shaped and how we might rethink our worldly engagements during and after times of emergency. We are currently working our way through our first of 5 fortnightly themes, the new anxiety, looking at the 300-plus-year technologies built to monitor our world that have been exposed as weapons-grade systems that pluralize reality and destabilize the present. You can stay up to date with all of our plans by joining our mailing list or downloading our Google Calendar. The link for both of these are going to be posted in the chat next to this live stream as I'm speaking. Today, I am exceptionally excited to present our first discourse event on recursivity and uncertainty. It's an event that is going to attempt to shine a light on or around 2 research projects that have been highly influential in the curation of this series. They are firstly, Schemas of Uncertainty, a research project on the relation between prediction and prescription within current social political structures. It was initially formed as a cross-departmental research group at Amsterdam's Sandberg Institute in 2018. Secondly, we have Recursive Colonialism, Artificial Intelligence and Speculative Computation, an online symposium that was organized at the tail end of 2020. It was produced in collaboration with the Trinity College of Arts and Sciences at Duke University, the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania, and the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Naples. It gives me great pleasure to now introduce our speakers, Danae Io and Ezekiel Dixon-Román. First to speak will be Danae Io, an artist living and working in Rotterdam and Athens. She is co-founder of the research project System of Systems and co-organizes the research initiative Schemas of Uncertainty. Her writing has been published by Sternberg Press, Serralva's Museum of Contemporary Art, and Contra Journal, and her work has been exhibited at Kunstverein Amsterdam, Het Nieuwe Institute in Rotterdam, Ceci Gallery of Art in Sao Paulo, Rich Mix in London, and elsewhere. Second to speak will be Ezekiel Dixon-Román. He is the director of the Master of Science in Social Policy program and chair of the Data Analytics for Social Policy Certificate of the Masters of Science in Social Policy program at the University of Pennsylvania. He also co-organized the Recursive Colonialism, Artificial Intelligence and Speculative Computation Symposium at the end of last year. After presentations by Danae and then Ezekiel, followed by a brief period of discussion between the 2 speakers, the event will culminate in a chance for you to ask questions you may have to our speakers. If you have any questions throughout our discussion, please post them in the YouTube chat next to this event or DM us on any of our social medias on Instagram, Twitter, or on Facebook. We will be sifting through these throughout the conversation, so feel free to post at any time, and any thoughts or questions you may have will be posted at the end to our speakers. Great. I'm now very happy to hand over this virtual microphone to Danae Io to begin her presentation.
Hi, I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Thank you so much for inviting me, Michael and Callum, and for organizing this very interesting program. I'm also very much looking forward to speaking with you, Ezekiel, later tonight. I've been following your work for a while and find it highly influential. So I'm really happy to be in conversation with you. Today we'll be doing a short talk, very short talk, that stems from the research produced as part of the project I co-organized with Callum Copley, called Schemas of Uncertainty. Since 2018, the project has taken multiple formats, from research groups to symposiums, a book, and a forthcoming online publication, among others, and has involved a number of collaborators without which it would not exist. Schemas of Uncertainty is a research project on the relation between prediction and prescription within current sociopolitical structures. The project examines the risks emerging technologies pose to the imagination of other possible futures or realities. From divination to machine learning, the project looks at the potential that exists at the limits of nobility, and considering uncertainty as a generative condition upon which other forms of sociability can be imagined. Today, I'll share with you some notes on uncertainty and predicted models, and not that much on divination, but if that is something you'd like to hear more about and how we've been dealing with, please feel free to ask questions later. I'll go through 3 short sections of some thoughts, and I'll begin with the first one called prediction/prescription. Under the current sociopolitical structures, uncertainty is managed by agents to fix the future into stable, yet merely approximate trajectories, ones which might be predicted, secured, and monetized. Through complex technological means, uncertainty is subsumed under the paradigm of prediction. Concurrently, uncertainty also becomes the very product of a capitalist system which creates the desire for certainty, while increasing the material and social precarity for the neoliberal subject who is ever more responsible for their own fate. In financial capitalism, prediction becomes a means to prescribe the future, operating within probabilistic models that presume the world can be rendered legible, calculable, and subsequently financialized. Taking linear time as a given, these models aim to predict the future by extrapolating tendencies from the past through a series of calculations and approximations. As Elena Esposito writes, the specificity of finance is not that it faces the uncertainty of the future, but that it makes uncertainty a resource. End quote. Even the most ostensibly unpredictable events, such as catastrophes themselves, are betted upon for profit through catastrophe bonds. These cat bonds quantify the risk of what has been otherwise described as acts of God to commodify it as a product, enabling their exchange on the market. In her book, Carceral Capitalism, Jackie Wang writes on the topic of predictive policing, quote, "Predictions are much more about constructing the future through the present management of subjects categorized as threats or risks. As such, predictions operate as political apparatuses which attempt to manifest the predicted outcome by virtue of generating these predictions. The predictive models tend to normalize the situation. The predictive models tend to normalize the situations in which they're entangled, as well as generate a desire for predictability. In the context of global capitalism and imperialism, these predictions normalize and reproduce the exploitative systems and questionable taxonomies they are generated by. 2. Producing legibility or predictive models as ways of imaging the world. Author Ariela Io, in her book Potential History and Learning Imperialism, has developed the term imperial shatter to describe various imperial operations that image the world and at once act upon it while concealing their operation and blur responsibility. I find her proposition useful to also think about predictive models. She's applied this term to also archives and the museum. Azule writes, and I quote, "In a split second, the camera's shutter draws 3 dividing lines. In time, between a before and an after. In space, between who or what is in front of the camera and who or what is behind it. And in the body politic, between those who possess and operate such devices and appropriate and accumulate their product, and those whose countenance, resources, or labor are extracted. The work of the shutter is not an isolated operation, nor is it restricted only to photography." She continues, "In the technological and historical discussion of the shutter, the only elements that matter are the quality, precision, clarity, and recognizability of the images, the end product, and the erasure of any trace of the shutter's operation." End quote. I think it is relevant to think about the ways predictive models operate similar to the imperial shutters, such as in the cases of predictive policing, border control, redlining practices, or even climate modeling. In the case of predictive policing, for example, a subject is being rendered into a legible identity for the state and at once a data metric. The subject is assigned a category of threat and separated from the live world, included in a database created by the commissioned engineers and owned by the state or a corporation. At that instance, the dividing line of who possesses and operates those models and whose data is being extracted is enacted. Similarly to the shatter, the application of those models separates, categorizes, and acts upon one's life, while at the same time concealing the means of that operation, be it through not knowing the training data or the exact model used, and many, many other ways, and making the process appear as neutral. Both the camera and modeling technologies are outcomes of a series of technical and social processes stemming from modernity and colonialism. Climate modeling offers a good example of other ways that the very model's active imaging has material effects on policy decisions. The general circulation models are a common tool that uses laws of circulation of air and water to generate the abstraction we call global climate. These models are self-conscious representations. They do not produce a description of the globe, but rather image it in the model. As Anna Singh argues, quote, they simplify and reduce the social and natural world to geophysical laws. In the process, they develop a globe that is unified, neutral, and understandable through the collection and manipulation of information, end quote. The required generalization of systems within models erases the specificities of collaborations by binding them through an a priori status of unity. General circulation models are used not only as predictive tools, but also as a means of negotiating policy decisions regarding the climate. For this reason, the erasure of particular perspectives by pre-establishing this unity within the global model can indeed have very actual effects on the kinds of decisions being taken. One such example is the failure to distinguish between the kinds of greenhouse gas emissions from northern and southern countries. Making the distinction between luxury emissions for northern countries and subsistence emissions for southern countries can provide more fair grounds upon which to negotiate. With these examples, I'm not trying to advocate for merely more accurate models, but I would like to highlight the layers of violence predictive systems enact by imaging and prescribing the future in the present in the service of global capital and progress. 3, and last section, uncertainty/unintelligibility. Thinking with Denise Ferreira da Silva's text on difference without separability, I argue that predictive models as ways of imaging the world can be seen as contributing to what she terms the ordered world. Founded in European thought, the ordered world is the perception created through scientific imaging that the world is composed of separate parts which relate to one another through mediation of units of measurement. Departing from a form of thinking that is based on fixity and ordering, da Silva proposes to consider descriptions of the world with features that contravene the parameters of certainty and separability. Da Silva writes, and I quote here, "What if, instead of the ordered world, we imaged each existent, human and more than human, not as separate forms relating through mediation of forces, but rather as singular expressions of each and every other existent, as well as the entangled whole in as which they exist? What if, instead of looking to particle physics for models of devising more scientific or critical analysis of the social, would tend to its most disturbing findings, such as non-locality as an epistemological principle and virtuality as an ontological descriptor, as poetical descriptors, that is, as indicators of the impossibility of comprehending existence with the thinking tools that cannot but reproduce separability and its aids, namely determinacy and sequentiality. Uncertainty, end of quote. Uncertainty and non-locality become violations to European thinking and potential guiding features towards imaging an entangled world. Denise Ferreira da Silva offers an opening to conceiving uncertainty as a generative means of approaching the world that isn't governed by subject-object relations and allows for imaging and imagining the world in non-resolvable ways and multiple iterations. This is my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danae, for that lovely presentation. If anyone has any questions for Danae, feel free to post them in the chat or message us, and we can relay them to her at the end of the event today. Without further ado, to keep things moving, I'm very happy now to pass over the microphone to Ezekiel Dixon-Román.
Thank you. Let me pull up the share screen here. Okay. So first, let me say thank you, Danae, for a really provocative and fascinating set of comments and remarks. I think literally we probably could spend the rest of the time just engaging your talk. But I guess what I would say, definitely what's nice is that there's a way in which what I'm going to offer here is a nice conversation, I think, with what you shared. So let me first extend my appreciation to Michael Braley and the organizers of the virtual reality. This is an exciting and fascinating event series, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I'm also looking forward to the conversation with Danae Io and thinking through uncertainty and indeterminacies with her. I'd like to begin with an example that Luciana Parisi mentioned in her conversation with Denise Ferreira da Silva during the Recursive Colonialism Symposium back in December of 2020. Luciana referred to the November 21st New York Times article titled "Designed to Deceive. Do These People Look Real to You?" And in fact, what I have up here in the share screen is from the New York Times article, and I'm going to work through and engage it some. So in this article is where generative adversarial networks are being employed to produce new, and I put in quotations, new human faces that can be toggled to range in age, eyes, mood, perspective, gender, and race ethnicity. As Luciana poignantly argued, the variation of these faces is scaled based on the recursive enfolding of difference into universal or Promethean man. Today, I'd like to use this example to provocate a set of propositions on haunting. I'm particularly interested in examining how time and space configure into these computational iterations of human faces, faces that are said to not be real, yet are based on the deterritorialized and reterritorialized visual data of human faces. I'm going to just also, as I'm reading here, I'm going to toggle through these faces so you can see even the iterations that and shifts that you see even in the current face that's up right now. Thus, in these deep fake faces are the disjointedness or discontinuities that mark the spectral immanence of the actual human faces in the present. I will refer to this example throughout my comments today, toggling the computationally produced variation of human faces from the New York Times article. Okay, Derrida and hauntology. Haunting is a concept that has long been of interest for cultural theorists. Hauntology in particular was Jacques Derrida's deconstructive intervention on ontology. Hauntology arguably encompassed much of Derrida's deconstructive concepts: the trace, difference within a, the supplement, absence of presence, among others. Hauntology, a play on the pronunciation of ontology, points to the non-full, non-total presence of being, that in every being, there's always already an absence of presence, an inheritance, a trace of that which was and that which is to come. In every being, there is a haunting. While Derrida engaged haunting and hauntology in various areas of his work, it was in Spectres of Marx where Derrida most famously developed hauntology as a deconstructive intervention on Marxism. This was a long-awaited intervention given Derrida's engagement with many other areas of thought like structuralism and phenomenology. And some have argued that even this intervention did not address Marx's historical materialism. It is here where he famously draws a quote from Hamlet to refer to haunting or spectrality. That is, quote, "the time is out of joint," end quote. In other words, it is the disjointedness or disadjustedness in time that indicate the presence of a ghost that sees us, but we are not able to see it. Others have taken up haunting, building on Derrida's theoretical developments of hauntology. As Avery Gordon states, quote, "In haunting, organized forces and systemic structures that appear removed from us make their impact felt every day, make their impact felt in everyday life in a way that confounds our analytic separation and confounds the social separation themselves," end quote. The haunting works in the gap of the seeming discontinuity between social structures and social institutions and everyday life. Similarly, for Karen Barad, hauntings are, quote, "a disorienting experience of the disjointedness of time and space, entanglements of here and there, now and then, a ghostly sense of discontinuity," end quote. Additionally, as Mark Fisher points out, hauntology is also about technology and the temporalities of technology that produce a virtuality, a relation to what is no longer and not yet. Teletechnologies in particular mark a collapsing of both time and space, shaping affects of nostalgia or anticipation. Again, the disjointedness of time and space affectively shape and indicate the present spectrality. It is this time or temporality that I want to focus on today. For Derrida, time was signified through the sign, a mark of the complicated and non-full presence of a ghost. I want to offer some propositions today toward rethinking time and haunting, its relation to recursion, and with Denise Ferreira da Silva, I want to think through the political ethical work of time, especially in relation to the problem of colonial articulations and the development of the human. Finally, I'd like to leave us with some considerations of what a Black feminist poetic thinking might offer us toward addressing, redressing, or rerouting the fears, anxieties, desires, and anticipations of the political affect of the no longer / what happened, and the not yet / what's yet to happen. Rethinking of hauntology via Whitehead's time. Toggling the New York Times deepfake faces raises questions about how time and space is configured and enfolded into the curation of these digital productions. As Elisa Giardina Papa has illustrated in her work, the generation of data for training affective computing is temporally and spatially situated, particularly in the global South, yet also processed by a technology that was developed from 19th century phrenology and assumptions of the transparent or liberal subject. Thus, racial logics became part of the nonlinear axiomatics of the technology. This materializes in part due to the temporal spatial situating of the subject and assumptions of development, progress, and narratives of cultural difference. It is for these reasons that I'd like to offer some propositions on temporality and, by entanglement, spatiality. Through these proposals, I hope to, 1, move beyond the modern categories of past, present, and future, to shift a theoretical gaze from the signifier to the becoming process and its material reconfigurings. And as such, 3, open up the potential for an alternative conceptualization of haunting that's based on the inheritance of colonial violence and racial subjugation, What Spillis has characterized as the intergenerationality of hieroglyphics of the flesh. Let me begin by saying that linear teleological time does not exist. Discrete categories of past, present, and future are inherited categories of modernism that were constituted by the interest in progress and development of colonialism and capitalism. According to Whitehead, all there is are conceptual prehensions and persuasions of the future in the supposed immediate present. The past is immanent in the present. The what happened and the no longer are enfolded in the present, encoding the fleshiness of bodily and technosocial systems. Whether it's the neurobiological or neural network, the sociogenic code becomes reinforced through the spiraling feedback loops of recursion. As described by Mark Fisher, the haunting of the past is instantiated in the disorienting experience of déjà vu or nostalgia, where the past is immanent in the immediate occasion or event initiating the coding of the flesh. The future is also immanent in the present. It is the virtual and what shapes affective anticipations and the constructed political necessity for algorithmic future prehension via prediction. The past is immanent in the future. It is future's past. The virtual becomes actual, and the actual is shaped by the virtual. From the anticipation of the virtual, the not yet, the what is yet to happen haunts the event toward what Masumi has called preemptive logics of power. Cybernetic predictions of the virtual are the preemptive logics of algorithmic governance that shape and become the actual. In other words, cybernetic predictive acts form the becoming actual that is haunted by future's past. I'm reminded here of a passage from one of Claudia Rankine's Prose and Citizen, where she says, you know, feelings destabilize since everyone you ask is laughing that kind of close the gap laughter. All the ha-ha-has wanting uninterrupted views. Don't be ridiculous. None of the other Black friends feel that way. And how you feel is how you feel, even if what you perceive isn't tied to what is. What is? And so it goes until the vista includes only displacement of feeling back into the body, which gave birth to the feelings that don't sit comfortably inside the communal. You smile dumbly at the world because you are still feeling, if only the feeling could be known. And this brings on the moment you recognize as desire. Close quote. Desire here for Claudia Rankine is that which is the pursuit of knowability, recognition of affect, and even the potentiality of subversion. Yet, desire is also that which is already slipping the grasp of the present, becoming future's past. The present is the era of both the conceptual or perceived past and future. Replacing the category of history in Masumi's characterization of, as he puts it, a history in the present, I restate this as a becoming process in the present, an affective becoming and material reconfiguring of encoded flesh. Yet to be clear, the haunting presence is not colonial reason or whiteness, nor is it the creative indeterminacies of Blackness or the flesh. Haunting, I argue, is the disjuncture or disjointedness that instantiates the recursive system's inheritance and enfolding of colonial violence and racial subjugation. It is precisely the temporal skip or spatial discontinuity in the becoming recursive process, as seen in the disadjustments of the toggled shifts in the deep fake faces. And with Parisi, it is that which is working in the interval between the infinite system and the incomputable infinities. It is the tension that's produced from the system's recursive efforts to self-regulate and maintain the changing same of colonial reason or whiteness in the face of the incompressibility of the creative indeterminacies of Blackness or the flesh, what Amy Césaire called the colonialist encounter or in the colonialist encounter in computational logics. Recursion, time, and haunting. I'm going to toggle down here a bit. I want to show another part here so you all can see also the ways in which the generative adversarial algorithm is being used to produce deep fake faces on a scale of age or mood or gender and race ethnicity. In each of these, what's quite interesting is the ways in which these are treated in a bipolar or dual or bipolar dimension. When in fact we might understand all of these as at minimum in a multiplicity of dimensions and even planes. So the ways in which even gender or race ethnicity, for instance, is being rendered here is already a collapsing onto a singular dimension that has a bipolarity, if you will. That's something we actually might want to. I'm happy to discuss further in the question and answer, even the conversation. Okay, time is a fundamental part of the feedback loops from outputs to inputs in a recursive system. It's via the temporal process that recursion is not simply looping back onto itself, but rather opens up to self-regulate and maintain a homeostatic system while processing contingencies, producing a spiraling process of recursivity. Recursion is a computational process of unfolding temporalities. According to Ukui, indeterminacies characterize not just recursive temporalities, but also recursive thinking. The halting problem of the incompressibility of what Gregory Shaitan has called omega and what Luciano Parisi has called incomputable is an instantiation of recursive haunting. The skipping of the incompressibility of indeterminacies is the appropriative logic of capital, seeking to compress indeterminacies into colonialist reason. In what ways do we see the recursive logics of the New York Times deepfake faces enfolding temporal spatial territories of political symbolic matter? For instance, in what I'm showing here with gender and race ethnicity. How is uncertainty or indeterminacies configured or not configured in and shaping the computational production of these faces? Okay, moving on to Ferreira da Silva on time and space. As I mentioned earlier, history, time, and space, as in geography, were important in shaping categories of difference. As Denise Ferreira da Silva argues, it is through the temporalizing of categories via Hegel's and Herder's natural history of racial categories that produces sociopolitical logics of raciality. It is via Herder's account of human history as situated in varying geographical contexts where he develops his conceptualization of the development of the interiority of human groups via their overcome achievements. Regarding Hegel, da Silva states that he places Herder's nature with, quote, Father Spirit, a gesture that further apprehends the world as the exhibition hall of an entity that belongs in time, an interior thing. There he finds that spirit had not done its work on African minds and territories, for the Negro lacked the ideas that registered the spirit's presence, end quote. Through Herder's and Hegel's move to make natural history and the spirit the causal force of development of a group's interior capacities, they cemented colonial ideas of progress and development, and as such, the manifestation of sameness and difference via what Winter has called man one and man two, or the cosmogonies of prototypical man. Consequently, time is not the only dimension in which haunting makes its appearance or apparition known, but as a significant premise in the conceptualization of the post-Enlightenment subject, time is also profoundly important for the spectrality of colonial violence and racial subjugation. In fact, time, history, and space, as demarcated by geographic context, or more specifically development, became the necessary descriptors in the formations of sameness and difference, as well as economic conditions, social conditions, human capacities, and even frameworks that inform social policies and practices of governance. Thus, that which is out of joint or disadjusted is always a haunting imbued with the political ethical concerns of colonial violence. As a result, the temporal skipping, spatial shift or blur, and political symbolic ambiguity of the deepfake faces mark the apparitions of the transparent subject of the post-Enlightenment. Finally, haunting as a condition of possibility. While I argue that haunting is the complicated unfolding of the affective patterns of the no longer and anticipations of the not yet that maintains or reinforces the changing same of the transparent subject, I also posit haunting as a condition of possibility. That is to say, the fact of the apparition's presence, its seething presence, demands address, redress, and or rerouting. I want to begin suggesting the importance of a Black feminist poetics here and how it can strengthen the conjuring work of diffraction. In Denise Ferreira da Silva's articulation of a Black feminist poetics, she seeks to push a thinking, a reading without modern categories. In fact, she pushes us to consider how modern categories, especially of time, history, or development, have shaped a text or an event, and as such to address the colonial and racial subjugation. Paying attention to the total value of the founding violence of global capital. This is a practice of thinking and reading that forces one to locate or identify the haunting logics of what happened that's imminent in the what happens, how the what happens anticipates the what is yet to happen, and how the what happened is already imminent in the what is yet to happen. By thinking the world as plenum, one can begin to image the transversibility, the traversibility, and the transubstantiality of the deepfake faces. The discontinuities and disjunctures of the deepfake faces are the diffractive patterns that are residual from the generative adversarial network's output. Borrowing from Karen Barad's articulation, diffraction is the way in which wave patterns overlap and how waves bend and spread when they encounter an interfering structure, producing differences that make a difference. The processed individual facial data are diffracted through generative adversarial network algorithms to produce the faces. And I'll refer to generative adversarial networks as GAN from here on out. The blurred spot, the mismatched accessories, the blurred out background, or the symmetry of on average asymmetrical faces are the diffractive patterns, are the diffractive wave patterns left in the wake of GAN's attempts to compress that which is incompressible, such as its inability to reconcile the psychic potential of the, and I should say, such as its inability to, quote, reconcile the psychic potential of the racialized individual with that of a predetermined technical structure, end quote, what Ramon Amaro has called the Black technical object. These diffractive wave patterns, in the wake of GAN's political symbolic formations of faces, also points toward the potentiality of computationally identifying, undoing, exorcising, or conjuring the bodies of the racial other in their diffractive wake. Through the computational identification of the diffractive wave patterns of temporal spatial disjoint, I argue, opens up the possibility of a Black feminist poetical reading of the haunting enfoldings of recursive logics. In other words, by identifying the discontinuities and disjointedness, it enables a reading of what happened, what happens, and what is yet to happen that occasions a potential address, undoing, or unmaking of the instituted violence that brought it into emergence. It is through such interventions that we might identify, exercise, or conjure instances, moments, and openings toward redressing, or more radically, rerouting or refusing the colonial and racial subjugation haunting our present. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ezekiel, for that lovely, sprawling presentation through hauntology and algorithmic thought and race, amongst other things. I'm now going to kind of disappear again for a few minutes and let you both speak. And yes, I'll see you soon.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for yours. I have a couple of notes and questions, but I'll let you jump in first if you'd like.
I also have some noted questions. But they're kind of a little bit general, but one I was really interested in the metaphor you used to describe recursivity as homeostasis.
Mm.
And I'd be quite interested if you can expand on that. Because I'm also thinking how like how does that relate to scale? I'm just like my first thought is of other kinds of predictions, and I'm thinking more about like high frequency trading and flash crashes of like the 2010s, and thinking how maybe like, I don't know, this is something I also haven't really addressed that much in my talk either, which is kind of important to bring up, but like how this maybe I'm just putting my, I don't know, thinking through what you mentioned, but like homeostasis is trying to maintain the same order and adapting, let's say the like capitalism, however I want to call the current sociopolitical system, and colonialism to different iterations, so it maintains its let's say hegemony. But how does that, like, the amount of recursion also, I guess, goes out of bounds at times, and is that out of bounds or is it not? I don't know.
Okay. Got it. Okay, so thank you for this question. So in some ways it'll open up to even other directions, if you will, for conversation. But so I think it's a homeostasis actually is a concept that is long within systems theories. And in fact, I mean, if we look back in the history in cybernetics and especially in systems theories, I mean, it goes back to, in fact, not just computation, but biological and cognitive systems. I mean, Maturana and Varela are examples of this. The very idea of homeostasis, which gets taken up in so many different ways, right? I mean, homeostasis gets taken up in psychology, it gets taken up in ecological systems, but literally the idea of seeking to maintain a system that seeks to maintain balance, or the ways in which a system seeks to maintain some kind of balance or equilibrium is another way of putting it. You know, I think what's important to keep in mind that there are different processes of recursion, right? So there is not, so the form of recursion that we're often talking about or even engaging with is an autopoietic form of recursion, or a closed system, right? So a system that merely seeks to, as it is processing, as a finite system, as it is processing information, it is reconfiguring itself, and especially when it approaches any forms of infinities or indeterminacies, right? I think. And then there's also the other forms of other systems of recursion, such as those that are allopoietic, that fundamentally seek to produce something different, right? And I think it's important to, you know, at least draw these distinctions, because in fact, an allopoietic system would not seek to necessarily maintain homeostasis under the same logic or the changing same. But in fact, under an autopoietic system, it fundamentally seeks to maintain the changing same logic or epistemology of the system, maintaining that equilibrium. So I think I'm looking at a couple of points or questions you raise. And so in relation to this question of how does it go out of bounds, or what, another way of thinking about that is how does the system account for that which is beyond its finite boundaries of logic, if you will. And I would say under those autopoietic systems, that which is beyond its finite logic, the system, depending on the algorithm, depending on the overall system, will update itself in order to account for those indeterminacies, that which is seemingly is incompressible to its existing logic. But it's not, that recursive system is not one that's just sort of folding back on itself, right? So just almost like a circular sort of system, but in fact, it's as I mentioned, it's a spiraling system. So it's processing that which is beyond its finite system, as it's trying to process indeterminacies. It is literally reconfiguring its logic in order to maintain the changing same, right? But even in that reconfiguring, while it's changing not back to original condition, it's changing to incorporate that which is indeterminate to it into its existing system in order to maintain the same the system of capital, fundamentally capital accumulation, right? And I would even go as far, I would even say not just capital accumulation, but racial capital, global racial capital. It's interesting, the question about scale. And I'm assuming you mean in the sense of, in a global sense, or thinking about larger
expansion of, but in some ways is already in what you mentioned in terms of like incorporating this indeterminacy.
Yeah, right.
And yeah, I mean, you mentioned Sylvia Wynter already, but this is like what I'm trying to. I mean, I've been on a reading group about Sylvia Wynter's essay on coloniality of being / blah, blah, blah. So I can see what you're saying. I'm trying to process it through that, and it's a very nice way of, I don't know, thinking of it through this particular example. And then also you mentioned like MAN 1 and MAN 2 and how these like different, let's say epistemological structures like shift through time to include whatever they need to include, so they keep reproducing themselves, which I guess is maybe what you're referring to. I don't know.
Right. I think that's precisely right. I mean, I think there's a way in which we might think of the current iteration of many forms of algorithmic techno-social systems, or even techno-political systems for that matter, as really functioning under MAN 2, right? And the cosmogony, if you will, of MAN 2, and in particular the ways in which they become sociogenically encoded from the cosmogonies of MAN 2. And also we see it, I mean, even with the example of predictive policing as an example, right? So there's a way in which the very categories that are being constituted into predictive policing are so situated in the biocentric model of MAN 2, right? As well as not just simply biocentric model, but also the biocentric model in relation to Homo economicus, right? So capital. So those categories of risk are conceptual, they're operationalized based on also an economy, based on, so not just risk of committing another violent offense, but also what does the law then do based on what one is predicted, what level of risk one is predicted. So are they putting out more resources to surveil? Are they putting out less resources to surveil? Are they keeping them incarcerated? The way in which they'll even articulate, even argue it within the eyes of the law, the juridical, we might say the political juridical argument they'll make is fundamentally, on the one hand, about saving lives, but on the other hand, about how to save resources. It becomes a neoliberal argument about efficiency as well.
But at the same time, it produces capital by funding that very system would produce more capital because of all the material and resources needed to have those people incarcerated, etc.
Yeah. You know, in relation to that, I actually wanted to raise a question for you in relation to how you're thinking about uncertainty in relation to indeterminacy. In part, I'm curious to unpack a bit. Where may uncertainty overlap with indeterminacy? Where might it part with indeterminacy? And one might think of, especially in statistical terms, one might think of uncertainty as referring to a probabilistic event or outcome. In relation to, whereas for indeterminacy, one might understand indeterminacy as physical causality, as in particular as that which requires a study of the very conditions of the system itself, the logic of the system itself. And yeah, so I'm curious to hear how you're thinking about uncertainty in relation to indeterminacy.
I feel like I'm still working my way through, yeah, the relation between uncertainty, indeterminacy, and unintelligibility. Another thing to add in. I think uncertainty, I mean, I guess we've used it in this project particularly because it has this relation to probability or something that can be approximated. It's not necessarily, it's not entirely, like it has this, I don't know, like tentacle to being approximated or calculated. But then, I don't know, like some people call radical uncertainty, what could in some instances be also named indeterminacy, like the condition of not being able to know about something, like the ontological condition of not being able to know about something. So I think in our research group, it's kind of included a bit of indeterminacy in it by thinking also through radical uncertainty. And it felt like more useful as a way of cutting across both technological systems, but also divination. But yeah, it's not a very clear answer, but
no, I mean it's helpful. I mean, I think one of the questions that I have is where to situate the sociopolitical in relation to, so and I appreciate this notion of radical uncertainty, if I and particularly as a way of thinking about uncertainty in relation to indeterminacy, and of course unintelligibility, which, you know, we could probably go off on a whole nother plane of conversation just on intelligibility, unintelligibility, and the sociopolitical, or even the sociopolitical and even political symbolic project of the Enlightenment on bodies and who's recognizable and who is not, who's intelligible, who is not. But the yeah, I am curious about the where is the sociopolitical in particular in relation to uncertainty and indeterminacies? Is there, do you see a nuance? Do you see a departure in any way? Okay.
I think uncertainty in some ways, in the way we've dealt with it, has been more like temporal. Like, but to me, yeah, it has to be paired with indeterminacy. So I'm just trying to ground it so I can process it. If we're thinking about like uncertainty, sorry, I'm trying to figure it out in my head. I feel like uncertainty in some ways can evade, like if it's not part of the sociopolitical, but And we're not really thinking about it in this way because you're thinking about the ways we relate to uncertainty, which in itself brings in the sociopolitical side to it.
Got it. So, I mean, one way one might enter this is to say that uncertainty is always under the gaze of the transparent subject, or of the post-enlightenment subject, or of colonialist worlding, if you will. The part that I'm wrestling with is that statistically, and thinking about this in sort of statistical paradigmatic language or speaking, right? That uncertainty is understood as sort of this, not sort of, but this probabilistic event or outcome that can be, and I'm going to put it in crude statistical terms, has some degree of certainty in its prediction, and some degree of, some degree of determinism in prediction, and some degree of stochastic or indeterminacy in its prediction. And I'm sort of putting this in the crude statistical language. I'm not necessarily saying I agree with this, right? But literally how, statistical terms, how it would be understood. And I think there's a way in which one might think about, one, that probabilistic outcome as being constituted by the worlding of colonialism, of colonial capitalism. But I think where the sociopolitical, and I think this is where you're going at, what I hear is, for radical uncertainty, is the indeterminacies of that system of cybernetic prediction. So that is to say, that which is incompressible to its system, that fundamentally has the potentiality of transforming the system. So one might even, where Blackness, or the creative indeterminacies of Blackness might be understood to be it's the materiality of its metaphysics might be understood, right? I think there's another way I also want to put this, but yeah, okay. I think no, I thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Your phrase is so much better. Thank you.
I kind of just want to jump in here actually and ask Ezekiel to kind of expand on that last point, maybe a little more, because one thing that I took from seeing this presentation last time was when you started to speak about incomputability within systems, particularly kind of in relation to the black technical object. And I wonder if that is something which you can kind of explain on and give more context to.
So yeah, and I feel like I'm not going to do Ramon any justice in his conceptualization of the black technical object, but maybe I'll approach it from a different angle without bastardizing Ramon's concept. But so I mean, I think the most straightforward way of thinking about incomputability, especially in relation to Blackness, I'll say, is if we understand systems as finite. I mean, I think that's sort of a given what we've been discussing. So if we understand systems as finite, and we also take seriously information theory's idea of information being infinite and dynamic in the world, right? One way of thinking about Blackness even within putting I might even say Moten and even De Silva's even conceptualization of Blackness in conversation with information theory on its terms, is to think about Blackness as of those infinities, of those the infinite creative indeterminacies of, as Moten would put it, Black performances. And thinking and understanding Blackness as a metaphysics that that then becomes materially constituted or materialized in particular ways of the infinite variability of Black performances. And in fact, if we understand Blackness as infinite variability of Black performances, then eventually, so some of those performances might be compressible to the system, but it's the infinite variability of those of Blackness that fundamentally will eventually become incompressible to the system to the system period, to a finite system. But I even want to say more, put it more specifically, to a recursive system of colonial capitalism that in fact seeks to make, has sought to make Black bodies the object of death, in fact, the object to discipline, to police, to surveil, but fundamentally a form of, whether it's slow death in the as Jasbir Puar will talk about it, or even a form of fast death, as we've seen countless times on videos of unarmed the state violence of unarmed Black and brown bodies. So I think I don't know if that helps as an articulation too. I mean, I can try to come at it another way, but that's what I mean by the incomputability, especially in relation to Blackness. Yeah.
Thank you for that. It's very, very interesting to hear about. And yeah, I wonder as well, like, if I was speaking recently with Christopher Oliver, who is also represented in our series. He's made a film called The Cosmogony of Racial Capitalism with Danae Io, which was also featured in the Recursive Colonialism symposium. Actually, I think it was after your talk as well, so it's really closely linked right now. And he spoke to me very briefly about opacity in that context, and I wonder if there's some extent of opacity itself kind of opening up an evasion of sorts to a system and producing a space for alternative systems, Black-centered systems, to be kind of made to run alongside or against, or in other ways to kind of support those communities. And I wonder kind of, how you relate to that idea.
So opacity for me, I think about in relation to glissant, and I think it's important to make clear for glissant, opacity was not about an opaqueness, if you will, but in fact that which is irreducible. And so there's a way in which, in fact, opacity has, in the glissant sense, has some relation to incomputability, because it's about that which is incompressible to the system. It's about that which is irreducible. And if we especially think about this in relation to Danae, unintelligibility, right? It is fundamentally that which is unintelligible to the system. The question is, what does that system do, or what are the ways in which the system allows for a right to opacity? And as glissant will put it, and in some ways, maybe it should be a question of, in what ways are certain ontologies or onto-epistemologies able to demand that right to opacity? I do think that there is a potentiality of a rerouting, even as glissant would say, of rerouting in that very what I would characterize as an onto-epistemology of opacity. Yeah, there was something else I was going to say, but it slipped my mind. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you. There was one other thing as well that I wanted to kind of pose to both of you, kind of coming off of the Schemas of Uncertainty work that I've seen, and it's kind of pointing towards these ideas of fate or of divination or even of zoomancy. And these are kind of knowledge systems that definitely have a place within, well, yeah, the wider Schemas of Certainty project for sure. And their kind of epistemological origin in this kind of higher dimensional being or object or deity, whether that's kind of like a god or a religious figure or a clairvoyant or a non-human intelligence or a swarm intelligence even, or even if we kind of think back to the technological in the traditional sense of like the latent space within the AI and the kind of the end dimensionality within that space where we can predict that decisions are made. So I was wondering kind of how, essentially like how this hyperdimensional thinking kind of in relation to your work, how it kind of functions. And I'm thinking of these systems outside, or kind of to quote, or kind of to go off Timothy Morton, phasing in and out of perceivability, how they kind of come in and out of focus to us, and how we kind of align ourselves with them throughout their kind of ongoingness.
I think there's like a large amount of variations of those systems because they've existed before colonialism. Many of them, of course, have been erased, but there's a lot of other ways of knowing and relating to the world and mapping of the relation between human and non-human matter in different ways. So I think for us, it comes as a way of conceiving other ways that human and non-human beings' existence can be seen as in relation. So there's obviously ways that this is, let's say, compressed in a much more deterministic way, like certain readings of how astrology is perceived, but doesn't mean that this is what astrology is. There is ways of seeing it as a deterministic system, and there's ways of not seeing it as such. And we were really influenced by the work of Danae Ferreira da Silva, but also Danae Ferreira da Silva's conversations with Valentina Desideri, who works with she calls like political readings, fake therapy. There's multiple ways of naming them, but ways of reading the world in multiple ways. And also in the work of Valentina Desideri and Stefano Harney, they've written this beautiful text called Fate Work, in which they're talking about how these kind of systems, be it tarot reading or tea leaves reading, bring more than one human and non-humans in relation and allow for like a system that can proliferate fates and not one fate, because with each reading there's other things you can and relations you can pick up. So it's, for us, it was a way of entering otherwise this deterministic or like outside or so it wasn't so much of the level or like the part of this system that is about creating an accurate depiction of what will happen or one core scenario of what is going to happen, but rather the relation between matter and humans and ways of recognizing what binds them together.
Danae, thank you. I haven't read the Stefano Harney one, but I'm now excited and really want to take a look at that one now. So I have a couple thoughts in here. One is, so first of all, the language divination in this context is so great because, in fact, there is a theology that is in the backdrop of all science, and particularly Western modern science technology. in fact, it's also in some ways in line or associated with the ways in which that Luciana Parisi and I have even talked about and thought about recursion in relation to colonial capitalism, in relation to apocalypse, right? So, and there's a way in which technology has served two purposes for capitalism, and one being technology being the cause of the acceleration toward entropy in and of itself. And in fact, it seeks to do that because, in fact, and the literally pushing it toward that limit actually produces the very conditions for capital production. While at the same time, technology being the savior, the salvation of the system itself. I mean, we, in the past year or so, we can see this quite clearly under the pandemic, where technology has served both purposes, if you will. But I'm also reminded too of, because I'm also reminded of Kara Keeling here in her work, Queer Times, Black Future. She talks about the use of speculative inquiry and under oh, of course I'm forgetting the oil company. At any rate, how in the early 70s, one of the oil companies that is escaping my mind actually turned to methods of speculation and approaching it from a multidisciplinary perspective. So understanding that projections from economists or even from engineers was always narrow and did not capture the complexities of the world. And so bringing in sociologists or historians and others as a way of trying to literally create not trying to, but in fact, developing a department of future scenarios, as they call it, and using that, and within that department, their main purpose was to develop the multiple different potential future scenarios given what information, what data they have in front of them. And then, of course, based on those multiplicity of different future scenarios, their goal was to shape the one that would maximize their capital production, their capital accumulation. And so I've raised this in part, to almost speak to what I also hear Kara Keeling saying to us, almost as a caution of, on the one hand, while the speculative has great potentiality, it also has been taken up for several decades now under interests of capital accumulation. And much of the question is really, what's the ethical political stance behind that speculative inquiry? What are the ways in which that the speculative is being taken up toward what ends? So yeah, I'll stop on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think that's probably a good place for us to leave it for tonight. So I will say thank you once again to Danae Io and Ezekiel Dixon-Román for joining us tonight for this discussion on recursivity and uncertainty. Please stay up to date with everything that's going on for the rest of these sprawling weeks that we have finishing. Our new anxiety theme will continue to run until the end of July as more and more things continue to come live. So join our mailing list and download our Google Calendar, and you can stay up to date in a very more easy way than through socials. Great, thank you very much once again to both of you, and I look forward to seeing the rest of you soon.